At the end of 2014, we were looking for venues where we could talk about our new book, and we got the best possible offer. Roger Howlett, chair of the program committee of the St. Botolph Club, offered us one of their club evenings, a talk followed by dinner. We decided to talk about the place of the club in John S. Sargent's life and work, with a complete account of the club's exhibitions of his pictures. And we wanted to answer a question that had hung over the club. Was Sargent really a member?
And so we needed to do some extra research in the club's archives, and those are kept at the Massachusetts Historical Society. Peter Drummey, librarian at the MHS, welcomed me in to read my fill of those precious letters, documents, and minutes of meetings.
When we came for our club evening on January 20th, 2015, Karen and I had been on the track of John Singer Sargent and his muse, Rosemary Ormond, for about 20 years. This club was the nucleus of Sargent's professional network in the United States, and he made it a family of friends and colleagues, too.
Sargent was a private and reserved man. He never wrote anything in the way of a memoir. His only public expression of his thoughts and emotions was in his paintings, watercolors, and drawings. But it is obvious in those works and in other sources that his little family, his slightly lame sister Emily, and his much younger sister Violet, and her children, and his real confidential friends were vitally important to him. The St. Botolph Club became his Boston extended family.
In 1880, long before John S. Sargent came to Boston as a professional artist, Boston had begun to be impressed by his technical excellence and his dramatic talent in portraiture. The St. Botolph Club was founded that year, and in May it had an inaugural show of paintings, including Sargent's impressive portrait of his master, that cool gentleman artist Carolus Duran. Sargent had shown it in the Paris Salon and the Society of American Artists in New York. The next few years brought Sargent more successes in Paris, a few sensations, and at least one scandal. Everybody knows about the Salon scandal of Madame X, decadent and disdainful, with her intense makeup and her fallen diamond strap. Henry James brought Isabella Stewart Gardner to Sargent's London studio in 1886, and there she saw the picture. Scandal amused her, and an artist who caused one, and who also painted like Velázquez and Goya and Hals, intrigued her. She informed Sargent that he would paint her portrait, and that it would be his best picture ever. The alert Boston art public was eager to make its own judgment when he came himself the next year. That first working visit of Sargent to America was a great piece of luck. Henry Gurdon Marquand, a trustee and later head of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, offered him a commission to paint Mrs. Marquand. A bad time, Sargent thought. He was still trying to establish his portrait practice in England, so he set a price for the portrait that was double his current fee. But then Marquand agreed to it, and Sargent had to come to America. 2 months, he thought, but he stayed for 7, including 11 weeks in Boston. He arrived September 17, 1887, and spent a month in Newport and another in New York City before arriving in Boston on November 8th. He stayed briefly at the St. Botolph Clubhouse at 4 Newbury Street, and then with his friends, the Edward Darley Boyts, who had come to Boston the year before. They had to launch their eldest daughter, Florence, into society. She's the daughter who's not looking at the painter. On that visit to New York and Boston, Sargent painted at least 16 commissioned portraits and about 6 more as gifts for his hosts and his friends. Most notably, he obeyed the summons of Isabella Stewart Gardner to repeat the sensation of Madame X in a portrait of herself. Frederick Porter Vinton, a founding member of the St. Botolph, lent Sargent his studio at 17 Exeter Street and organized a one-man show for him in the club, where Sargent already had a crowd of friends, supporters, and patrons. The club did not produce a catalogue for the show, probably because its exact makeup was unknown until the doors actually opened. Some of the canvases were scarcely dry. John Sargent attended the opening reception and dinner, members only, on January 28, 1888, and that very night took the train to New York City, leaving the pictures to speak for themselves. He was literally tongue-tied in public. Even a toast was difficult for him, and he never spoke to reporters. The pictures were up until St. Valentine's Day, and the clubhouse was opened to ticketed visitors every day but Sunday from 11 to 3, and it was crowded with a delighted and gossipy public. Susan Hale, in her column Chit Chat in the Boston Globe on February 5th, caught the excitement.
I pay my daily homage to the Sargent pictures hanging in the rooms of St. Botolph's Club, and while I am trying to get a chance to know my own mind about them, I note the extravagant variety of opinions that sway the assisting crowd. One day it was, "What does Sargent mean by painting such pictures? That red background is all wrong. That posture is an impossibility. Those children are too small. That nose is too big." The hubbub of disapproval rose to the skylight, while all these self-made critics turned their backs on the pictures to exchange epigrams they had just made or just heard. A stranger was heard saying, "Mr. Sargent seems to have been singularly unfortunate in his sitters." The next time all was changed. An equal crowd was before the pictures, but in a different mood. These people were bubbling over with praise. As I came in, I heard this solemn sentence delivered in a low tone by a sage in the ear of a disciple: "That large painting is the best picture now in the world." This crowd had the same tendency to see with their backs and to spend their time telling each other the right thing to think about the paintings, rather than in quiet inspection. Why try to change human nature? That was the chit-chat. Here's the St. Botolph show. 8 of the canvases were already owned in America before Sargent's visit, and the owners were almost all Bostonians and St. Botolphers, who were happy to show off their early prizes from the hand of the prodigy, who was now being lionized. Of these, 6 were portraits painted abroad. Those of Mr. and Mrs. James Lawrence were destroyed by fire in 1939. Hers was the one with the red background that was all wrong. The St. Botolpher lawyer and politician, Mr. Thornton K. Lothrop. 2 American women who had made spectacular English marriages, like Edith Wharton's Buccaneers, Lady Playfair and Mrs. Wilton Phipps. She was the daughter of a St. Botolpher, Samuel Russell, and Sargent's distant cousin. And an informal portrait of Robert Louis Stevenson, which had been commissioned by St. Botolpher Charles Fairchild as a present for his wife. A friend of the tubercular Stevenson said, "It was living to the tip of the cigarette." The other 2 pictures, already in Boston, were then and are now 2 of Sargent's most applauded masterpieces. You may have seen this one tucked away in an obscure corner of the Museum of Fine Arts. These are the nieces of Robert Apthorp Boyd. He was a founding year member of the club and later its president. El Jaleo, the large picture, had been a big hit with the Parisian critics and public in the Salon of 1882. T. Jefferson Coolidge, a founding member of St. Botolph, bought that picture right off the wall of the Salon and his sister-in-law, Isabella Stewart Gardner, liked it so much that she borrowed it and rebuilt her music room in Fenway Court as a shrine for it, and so Coolidge had to give it to her. Also included in the show were 4 paintings that Sargent had carried with him from Europe, probably to give away as guest gifts. They were a complete change of pace from the portraits and blockbusters that were already in Boston. 3 of these were Venetian scenes that he had painted in 1880 and 82, Venetian bead stringers, the sulphur match, and a street in Venice. And there was a picture vaguely entitled Watercolor of Ships, which has not been identified. Sargent had not painted many pictures that could have had that caption, ships, rather than boats or gondolas, watercolor and not oil. It could have been this marvel, made in Nice about 1880. Finally, there were 10 portraits that Sargent had begun and finished during the last 4 months. Mrs. Marquand, the sitter for whom Sargent had come to America, gazes benignly over the proceedings and thinks smugly about Whistler's mother. Caspar Goodrich, in his sailor suit, was the son of Admiral Goodrich, Sargent's host in Newport. Ruthie Sears Bacon, the daughter of a young family with whom Sargent had become friendly in Newport. Mrs. Fairchild, the poetess wife of Charles Fairchild. Sargent had met the Fairchild family in Europe, and their daughters became best friends of Sargent's teenaged sister Violet. The war hero and diplomat Charles Lucius Fairchild, the older brother of Charles Fairchild, had come all the way from Wisconsin for his sittings. The 2 sons of Mrs. Forbes. This one was stored in an attic after the show because Mrs. Forbes didn't like it. Mrs. Inches, a cousin-in-law of the Boyts. This is the one with the nose that was too large. She tried to get Sargent to fix it during his trips to Boston in the 1920s, but he never found the time. Sargent painted this as a Christmas present to his artist friend Dennis Miller Bunker, a young cavalier of Isabella Stewart Gardner's. His name, like Sargent's, does not appear in the various compilations of St. Botolph members, but he was supposed to have been one. He was certainly a founding member of another Boston artists' club, the Tavern Club. The 2 clubs were rivals in baseball, but they boasted many of the same famous members, likely not baseball players. Sargent, Frederick Porter Vinton, Thomas Fox, Ignaz Gaugen-Giggle, Charles Leffler, Karl Muck. Here is the mother of the daughters of Edward Darley Boyd, dressed for her daughters' coming-out parties.
A New York writer made the most of the vague aura of scandal surrounding Sargent's picture of Isabella Stewart Gardner. The mystic smile, if smile it be, upon the quivering lips of this portrait was the prime tour de force of the whole exhibition, and the discussion is still hot as to what that smile signified or what it concealed. In the St. Botolph show, the picture was not captioned as her portrait, but as a psychological study. Woman, an enigma. Mr. Jack Gardner, whose brother George Augustus was a founding member of St. Botolph, was not satisfied. Abusing the husband's prerogative to be candid, he told her, "It looks like hell, but it looks just like you," and he forbade it to be shown again while he lived. And although Mrs. Gardner did think it was the best thing Sargent had ever done, she was happy to let the legend percolate while the picture remained unseen. Susan Hale, in her February 19th chit-chat column, spoke for the city.
Has anyone thanked the club for letting us see the pictures in the admirable light and comfortable atmosphere of their room? They could have had no motive but the pleasure of the public and the satisfaction of collecting so many paintings by an artist of worldwide reputation.
For 3 more months, Sargent worked and gained fame in New York, living in a hotel, renting a studio, and painting portraits of notables. On April 2nd, he gave a banquet for 30 New York artist friends, and when he sailed for Europe in mid-May, he left behind a solid foundation for a professional career in the States. Sargent spent all of 1890 in New York and Massachusetts. That year brought him the contract that he considered the great professional opportunity of his life, the murals in the Boston Public Library. Sargent devoted his greatest care for the next 30 years to that mural cycle, The Triumph of Religion. At the midwinter exhibition of the St. Botolph Club, as a treat for Boston, Sargent showed his new portrait of Sir George Henschel, the first conductor of the Boston Symphony Orchestra. He also showed A Morning Walk. The model was his younger sister Violet, 18 at the time of the painting. He showed the picture again that year at the Union League Club and the Society of American Artists in New York and at the Art Institute of Chicago. It was like sending the flattering portrait of a princess to every court that might have a spare prince to marry. Sargent wanted to find Violet a good American husband to get her out of the clutches of Francis Ormond, the ne'er-do-well heir of a Swiss cigar business that he had no interest in running. Violet stayed with her friends, Sally and Lucia Fairchild, on Commonwealth Avenue, and appeared in Boston artistic and conventional society, while Sargent took a studio in New York and painted. Alas, no American suitor appeared, or none that suited Violet, and when she returned to Europe she did marry Francis. Violet gave him 6 children in rapid succession, like so many anchors in a storm, but Francis remained footloose all his life. Their second child was Rosemary Ormond, the Muse in the title of our book.
Sargent finished the canvases for the north wall of the library in a barn studio in Gloucestershire and sailed over to install them in 1895. That was a 2-week job. And the beginning of Sargent's close collaboration with Thomas Fox, an architect for the library and a member of St. Botolph since 1893. Sargent brought his second installation into the BPL in 1903, the South or Christian Wall. Thomas Fox acted again as his architectural liaison with the library. Then and in the future, in the library and the Museum of Fine Arts, Fox provided Sargent with the radical building modifications and the precise measurements that he needed to perfect his task as he conceived it. Sargent was Fox's artistic ideal, a master workman. In the centerpiece of the MFA decorations, Sargent paid Fox a private tribute by showing a novel allegory, painting and sculpture, embraced by architecture. Another friendship Sargent developed in Boston was with the Bavarian-born painter and St. Botolpher, Ignaz Gaugengigel, a popular master of 2 manners. For his portraiture he was called the court painter to the Back Bay. And for his delicate costume genre scenes, the Meissonier of America. Besides being a charming dinner companion, he was a willing chess player, and chess was a game that Sargent played avidly.
On October 27, 1903, a French celebrity came to the club as a 2-week guest, the famous art historian André Michel, who was starting a lecture tour for the Alliance Française. In his early career as an art journalist in Paris, André Michel had reviewed many of Sargent's paintings in the Salon with candid admiration, and they were professional friends. Michel was brutally overbooked on his 2-month lecture tour, delivering 73 lectures in cities as far south as Baltimore and as far west as Chicago. We came across this relic of his visit. 11 January 1904. Monsieur, since I left Boston, I have been waiting for the bill or little charge for the laundry, which someone forgot to put on my bill, and which I mentioned to the secretary of the club. I am hastening to send the enclosed $3. With renewed thanks for the hospitality of the St. Botolph Club, André Michel. Why should we mention such a trifle? Well, in 1903, André Michel's son Robert was 19 years old, and Sargent's niece, Rosemary Ormond, was 10. And here is where she enters our story. In January 1906, Sargent's mother died. He was 50 that year, and reassessing how he wanted to spend his time and his talented energy, and what he wanted to accomplish above all. He identified the Boston Public Library mural cycle as the peak that he wanted to achieve, the basis of his lasting reputation. He painted his self-portrait because he had promised it to the Uffizi, and that was his farewell to portraiture as a profession.
He took to spending many weeks of the late summers in the Alps, where the air was clear and the light good and the landscapes challenging. And the human subjects were his friends and family along for the holiday. From 1906 to 1912, Rosemary Ormond was a part of that alpine idyll. And those were exactly her teen years. Sargent was charmed by his lovely niece. Painted her again and again and again, up to the time of her marriage.
That came in August 1913. Her husband was Robert André Michel, the son of the Paris art historian. Sargent thoroughly approved of the match. He wanted Rosemary to be happy, and for exactly a year she was. In July 1914, Sargent chose a different venue for his painting holiday, the Austrian South Tyrol. He was a citizen of the world in a way that became forever obsolete at the end of that month. Careless of politics, he crossed from neutral Switzerland into Austrian territory without a passport on July 27th, just in time to be trapped there when war made a passport indispensable for any American moving between belligerent and neutral territory.
Sargent kept busy painting, but he fretted incommunicado about the ones he loved. He was a foreigner without papers and short of money. His letters were returned without explanation, and mail from his family arrived late or not at all.
Rosemary sent a letter to her grandmother in Switzerland for reposting to her uncle, telling him that Robert had been mobilized in a reserve infantry regiment. Sargent wrote back on October 14th. Ma chère Rosemary, it's kind of you to have found the time to write to me, among all the preoccupations of moving house and of the Red Cross. Yet I think it is much better that you should have plenty to do at a moment like this, when the idea of the danger facing Robert could take you over completely. Consider instead that it's a source of pride both for him and for you, that he is taking an active role in that noble resistance which the whole world knows to be just. And don't be surprised if you receive no letters. Here as well, officers' wives are having to manage without news from their husbands, who are not yet over the border. And, dear Rosemary, remember that I share your worries and concerns. I hope that you will soon receive good news. A week later, Sargent had a telegram from Geneva. Robert had been killed on the Soissons front. As soon as he could, he secured a passport from the American embassy in Vienna, made a visit of condolence to Rosemary and her Michel family in Paris, and returned to his London home of Chelsea.
All his friends there were involved in the war, the men in large numbers in the forces, the women rolling bandages and holding benefit teas and auctions. He made some little contributions, offering drawings and watercolors for charity, but he felt pretty useless. Early in 1916, when his latest pieces for the Boston Public Library were ready, Sargent sailed over to install them and took up his Boston life afresh, including the St. Botolph Club. When he arrived in Boston, his friend Thomas Fox introduced him to the club as his own guest for 2 weeks. That was on April 9th. Then, in the minutes of the Executive Committee for May 22, 1916, we read, "A letter from Mr. Thomas A. Fox suggesting that the courtesy of the club be extended to Mr. John S. Sargent of London, on motion of Mr. Cole, duly seconded, it was voted to extend the hospitality of the club to Mr. Sargent during his stay in Boston, under the provisions of Section 2 of Article 4 of the Bylaws." And so Sargent belonged formally to the Fellowship of St. Botolph. He took rooms at the Vendôme and rented a studio in the Pope Building at 221 Columbus Ave. He worried helplessly about his sisters and Violet's children in London, about Rosemarie, who had become a nurse for blinded soldiers in a rehabilitation hospital in Paris. Both cities were suffering air raids. He treated his anxiety by keeping busy painting. He had to finish the latest installment in the library cycle, and with the help of Thomas Fox, to install those canvases. And he and Fox added to their adventure in public decoration a commission for the murals at the Museum of Fine Arts.
The St. Botolph Club was not a refuge from the war. The majority of the members were not neutral like Sargent, but pro-Ally. They felt that war with Germany was bound to come, and that the United States must prepare for it. The executive committee invited the members to march behind the club's banner in a preparedness parade. But other members of the club espoused the German side. Back in December 1914, Ignaz Gaugengiegel had been one of the founders of the Bostoner Deutsche Gesellschaft that organized a monster charity auction for the German war-wounded widows and orphans. Several German ocean liners were interned in the neutral port of Boston. Their cooks and stewards staffed the banquet. The ship's orchestras provided the music under the baton of Karl Muck, conductor of the Boston Symphony Orchestra, and the charity auctions were run by the Women's Committee, led by Mrs. Muck and Mrs. Gardner.
During the autumn of 1916, Sargent worked daily on the scaffolding in the library, modeling and gilding every least bit of ornament, repainting whole passages of his panels, attaching them to many yards of ribbed corduroy, so applied as to make the diffusion of light more interesting than from flat surfaces. That is the report of Thomas Fox. Only the prodding of his patrons made Sargent finally stop tinkering with the details, and the installation was unveiled for the public just before Christmas of 1916. The Marian Arch and the 6 lunettes. Like the work that had gone before, this installment garnered him almost universal praise, and Sargent himself was pleased.
But the war kept slouching closer to Boston and St. Botolph. At the end of March 1917, Abbot Lawrence Lowell, the president of Harvard, offered a motion that the United States of America ought to be in form, as it is in fact, at war with a common enemy, and that the Congress be therefore urged to declare that a state of war exists with Germany. The motion passed, but scarcely in time to make a difference. The United States Senate declared war on Germany a week later, on April 6, 1917. Karl Muck resigned his membership of the club on April 18th. The mild-mannered Bavarian, Ignaz Gaugengigel, continued to speak out in favor of the German cause. He even defended the sinking of the Lusitania with the loss of 1,200 civilians, saying that they had been warned of the danger by the German consulate and should not have been on board. His friends advised him to stay away from the tavern club until tempers had cooled. Instead, he resigned his membership in the club. He bore the episode as a sad personal affront to the end of his days.
The sinking of the Lusitania also touched Sargent. One of the dead in that disaster was Sir Hugh Lane, an illustrious Irish art dealer and collector. Lane had pledged to donate £10,000 to the Red Cross when Sargent painted a portrait of a personage to be named later. When the United States declared war on Germany, the trustee of the scheme, the National Gallery of Ireland, chose President Wilson to be the sitter. While Sargent waited for the call to go to the White House for this task, an equal donation to the Red Cross was offered if he would paint the American industrialist and philanthropist John D. Rockefeller. So, in the spring of 1917, Sargent traveled to the financier's home in Florida. He coupled the trip with a visit to his old friends, the Deering brothers, in Ormond Beach, Florida, and he went on a fishing trip on the Deering's houseboat called Nepenthe, forgetfulness.
He wrote to Fox, "The days and weeks fly by. It is disgraceful, and I am still down here. I think I mentioned before that I was induced to go on a fishing cruise of a week. Here we are in the Gulf of Mexico and still outward bound. Fishing is hard work, but the rest of the time it's very lazy and monotonous. The principal event is that I caught a tarpon over 6 feet long and weighing 140 pounds. My arms ache with pulling in various and heavy fish, but only one tarpon. I lost the others. Not a periscope so far, but some risk of being sniped at by patrols on viaducts."
When Sargent got back to Boston, he applied for a regular, non-resident membership in the St. Botolph Club, and he was duly elected on June 19, 1917. He would remain a member of the club until his death, but it was never again as important to him as it was in those anxious years of the war. In the fall, Sargent finally was called to Washington to paint the president. He found that Wilson shared his interest in camouflage, and that made the sittings easier.
That winter in Boston, the war news continued bad. The American troops were not yet actively engaged in the fighting, and the future was as uncertain as ever. The atmosphere in the club smoked with a pro-war fervor. On March 25th, the Boston Globe carried the headlines, "Germany's Big Guns, Stunning Surprise, Range 76 Miles, Beyond Wildest Expectations." Also that day, Karl Muck was arrested as an enemy alien. He would be interned in an army camp in Georgia for the duration of the war. That evening, the club formed a committee for defining and enforcing the position of the club in support of the United States and its allies during the present war. On Saturday, March 30th, the Boston Globe brought the news of a Good Friday calamity in Paris, and Sargent must have feared but did not know that it was news of Rose Marie. "Shell kills 54 women at worship in Paris." The article went on, "Rescue parties at work in a church which was struck yesterday by a shell from a German long-range gun have found more bodies. The shells struck the north side of the church, bringing down part of the roof and opening a breach 12 feet high and 20 feet wide. Nearly all of the debris fell inward upon the heads of the worshippers 60 feet below. The enormous mass of stone, crumbled into all shapes and sizes, lies in the middle of the nave. Then a cable came from André Michel, relayed by Violet from London. Rosemarie killed in bombardment of Paris, 29 March. Sargent wrote back to his sister, "My dear I have just got the terrible cablegram of Rosemarie's death, and I can't tell you how sorry I am for you and you all, and how I feel the loss of the most charming girl who ever lived. And what a death! I hope it was instantaneous. It makes me feel all the more that I ought to be with you instead of over here, as I wrote you lately. You will be wanting to go to Paris, but I dare say it's not possible at such short notice. Your loving brother, John S. Sargent." Thomas Fox remembered being at the St. Botolph Club that evening, when Sargent had an invitation to dine out of town. "There was a call to the telephone about 8 o'clock. I have just had bad news from Paris," said he. "My niece has been killed, and I think I won't go out to dinner. I'll come around to the club." This he did. There were no details, only a cable from England giving the bare fact. "It was Rosemarie," said he. "Her husband was killed at the beginning of the war. She was very young and one of the most beautiful and attractive women I ever knew, and this meant much from him. Dinner was ordered with the hope on my part that nothing would happen to intensify the blow. Before the meal was ready, however, who should come in but the painter in question. That was Ignaz Galgengigel, and Fox tells us he had been and still was in the minds of many more anti-ally than even his birth would justify. Sargent's deep-rooted noblesse prevented all awkwardness, as Fox remembered. The painter asked, "Have you dined?" "No," said Sargent. "Won't you dine with us?" And when he had gone to the desk to order, Sargent said, "I don't think I'll tell him what has happened." Sargent immediately booked passage to Southampton. Thomas Fox came to help him clear out his Boston studio after 2 full years of occupation, and he remembered, "As we were beginning, Sargent said, 'There's one letter I must find.' He went over the few which had apparently been kept more carefully than the rest, and then began to search among the others. He was evidently much disturbed, but finally said, 'Here it is, and I am much relieved it's found.' The envelope had a black border, and the letter was written in French. He didn't say so, but it must have been the last that came from Rosemarie." While Sargent was waiting for a ship back to England, the club's executive committee proposed, and the club unanimously adopted, a resolution that forbade all disloyal acts or words by club members, and requested the resignation from the club of any member who does not give unreserved support to the government of the United States and to its allies in the prosecution of this war. Ignaz Galgengigel did not resign. Instead, he kept away from public events in those days, lost in his own worry about the danger that his relatives faced. Without a doubt, he regretted his resignation from the Tavern Club, severing the bonds that held him together with his fellow artists in a community of civilization.
Back in England, Sargent accepted a part in the War Artists Project. This gave him 2 advantages that he wanted: a service to the Allied cause that he was uniquely qualified to perform, and a way to get into France in wartime. He had to get to Paris, to visit Rosemarie's grave, and to give his condolences to her French family, the André Michels. What he painted in France shows that her brave life and tragic death were constantly on his mind. Bombed churches and Gothic vaults reduced to rubble. And finally, the noble blinded soldiers of Gast, his monument to the blinded soldiers to whom Rosemarie had dedicated her widowhood. He finished that great painting in his Fulham Road studio, and then had Thomas Fox send him the precise measure of the 2 shrine frames in the Boston Public Library for his last works in that cycle, installed in 1919. The allegorical paintings of synagogue and church are a cryptic memorial of Rosemarie and Good Friday, 1918. Sargent spent more than half of the last 6 years of his life in Boston, 4 separate trips, each one accompanied by his sister Emily, and on 2 occasions also by his niece Wren, and once by Violet as well. With his harem, as he called them, he was less dependent on the club for company and good cheer, but he retained his member status. He continued working on the MFA murals. Then added the war memorials in Widener Library, Harvard. From November 20th to December 2nd, 1922, the St. Botolph Club gave the second of its one-man Sargent shows. This one was a far different affair from his first show. In 1888, Sargent had been on a fast track to the pinnacle of his profession as a portraitist. In this second show, 34 years later, he exhibited a wide sample of his personal art, and his target audience was his fellow artists. The 22 paintings in the show, 5 oils and 17 watercolors, were lent by St. Botolphers. Including 3 lent by Sargent, 1 owned by the club, and 1 big oil, Samplon landscape, lent by Mrs. Montgomery Sears. There were a few other pre-war paintings. An alpine brook, and a Tuscan landscape, and a church interior. 9 of the paintings were quite new, from summer holidays in New Hampshire and Maine. 5 had been painted at the quiet retreat of the painter Dwight Blaney on Ironbound Island, where Sargent vacationed in 1921 and 22. Here are the Blaneys at home on their piazza. 5 were done during the war years, but there were no war mementos. 1 from the Rockies, 3 from Florida, and 1 from the Pocantico Hills. And there were 4 portraits that Sargent had painted for his own pleasure over his long career. Most recently, Mrs. James, the wife of Billy James, whose Brookline studio Sargent sometimes borrowed. Hoker Abbott, the longtime president of the Tavern Club. Joseph Jefferson, the famous comic actor, painted in 1890. And reconnoitering, Ambrogio Raffaele, an artist companion of those exhilarating alpine summers. Also in the show were 19 preliminary studies in charcoal, not further described. These were among the hundreds of studies Sargent had made for the BPL, MFA, and the just unveiled Widener mural decorations, the public works that Sargent considered his greatest accomplishments.
Sargent's last visit to Boston, from October 1923 to July 1924, he completed his design notes for the MFA murals. Back in his London studio, he finished the MFA canvases, packed and consigned them for shipment to Boston, had a bon voyage dinner with his sisters and friends, and died in his sleep on April 15, 1925. Thomas Fox, who knew Sargent's wishes for the MFA project in exact detail, supervised the installation. Then he continued his service as an artistic executor in close communication with Sargent's sisters to ensure that the vast collection of Sargent's drawings and sketches were not sold off quickly, as Francis Ormond proposed. Instead, as Sargent would have wanted, they were kept in organized series, and given to institutions to be used in their art education programs. Fox devoted much of his time in the next 5 years in detailed correspondence with Emily Sargent and the huge task of sorting, cataloging, negotiating, framing, insuring, and shipping the works to be distributed. He made reams of notes for articles and a book about Sargent, started a complete catalogue of Sargent's works, but never finished any of these for publication. Never mind. His service to his friend was already complete. Gaugengigel was still a well-loved member of St. Botolph when the war fevers passed, though he had become something of a recluse, depressed by the enmities he had made or fancied during the war years. When he resigned from the club in 1930, it was for economic reasons. The club refused his resignation and made him an honorary member. Fox continued to live at the club. He was constantly a committee member, frequently an officer, and finally, as oldest living member, he was called the Memory of the Club. In January 1934, just weeks after the repeal of Prohibition, he successfully organized the 12th Night Revels, and the club minutes rejoiced that there had been many demands on the cellar that evening, and that the ensuing revenues from this source would prove very helpful in swinging us from red to black figures. That was Fox's last great service for the club. The architect's mental precision gave out with his age. By 1939, the club was no longer able to care for him, and he was moved from the room where he had lived for 46 years, first to his brother's house and then to a hospital. He died in 1946.
Between January 20th and April 15th, 1988, Sargent's third one-man show at the St. Botolph was mounted to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the first one. This one was a display of charcoal studies for his murals in Boston, sketches like these. Thomas Fox wrote that Sargent considered portraiture a comparatively low form of the art of painting, making homely people handsome to please their family. Next, in ascending scale, he placed figure composition and landscapes, and above them at the top, Sargent ranked public decoration as the highest task to which a painter could aspire. Each of his one-man shows at the St. Botolph Club illustrated a step in Sargent's growth as an artist. And this retrospective show in 1988 highlighted the neglected public decorations, which Sargent considered his greatest challenge and his enduring artistic legacy. The catalogue of the 1988 exhibition included a posthumous essay by the St. Botolpher and muralist R.H. Ives Gammell, in which he lamented the state of the murals, their decay, grime, and bad lighting. His was an influential voice in the reassessment of the murals, and it surely helped to inspire the spectacular cleaning and restoration that was finished in 2003. When we started our research, we knew that there was a link between the St. Botolph Club and John Singer Sargent. We discovered how completely the club became his social and professional family in Boston. And 3 generations later, we were pleased to share our curiosity for all things Sargent with members of his favorite Boston club.